ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Rosalie Ham grew up in a town of just 800 people, a place where the mice plagues got so bad she'd find mice poo in her cornflakes. But what fascinated Rosalie most about where she lived were the human residents. The man who talked to lampposts, the turkey farmer allergic to turkeys, and the woman who came off second best in a battle with a sewing needle. Many years later, when Rosalie sat down to write a book, this was the world she returned to. That novel, The Dressmaker, became a surprise runaway hit and was turned into a movie starring Kate Winslet. Writing then became a different kind of refuge for Rosalie over the many years she cared for her husband Ian. Her new novel is called Molly. Hi, Rosalie.
Hello.
What did this town that you grew up in look like when you were a kid?
Well, it was a lot bigger when I was a kid. It's not so big now. It's basically about 6 blocks in total, I think, possibly a few more. It's got a creek, it's got a railway station, it's got a water tower, and it's vast, vast flat plains around it with scrubby kind of vegetation everywhere, a lot of sheep. And these days there's a lot more exotic crops, but back when I was a kid it was wheat, sheep, cattle, and that was about it.
Were there people who spent their whole lives there?
Oh yeah, definitely. There's people that have lived there their whole lives and really not ventured very far at all, but been perfectly content there and lived a whole real wonderful life, you know. And they've got a library, you know, so it's all good. When I was a kid, the librarian was Mrs. Goldsack. She was always enormously quiet and very respectful and stamped the books very lovingly. And, yeah, I'm very fond. And I used to like going to the library partly because of Mrs. Goldsack.
How did your family end up in this spot?
Oh, well, my grandfather, Hedley William de Robert Ham, went there finally in 1923 and bought property. He bought a few before he settled on one that his wife was happy about. But he went there to breed sheep. He was a wool classer and he travelled a lot around Victoria, New South Wales, classing sheep. And he wrote to my grandmother from 1898, I think, to 1923. And so I gleaned a lot of information from those letters when I translated them for my dad. And they ended in 1923 when he went to Jerilderie and bought what they called Lara Plains.
So sheep, but also mice. What do you remember about mice?
Look, you know, every country kid that's lived through a mouse plague knows this, and you kind of can't describe what it's like to people. But it was a source of diversion. It was a diverting thing. It was unusual. It was something, it was before TV that I remember really. And so they were just fair game, us and the mice. And we did have my brother kept pigeons and chooks and lizards and all sorts of things. And for his chooks, there was a large 44-gallon drum in what we called the feed shed. And the mice used to get into that 44-gallon drum and build little houses, you know, little warrens, and they were solid, but they were eating them at the same time, so it was sort of fairly fetid and terrible place. But one of our favourite things to do was to bang the side of it so that the mice went crazy, and then we would either pummel them with a stick or a piece of downpipe, and we regarded that as perfectly normal behaviour. So it was kind of macabre, you know, it was a macabre childhood. My dad would slaughter a sheep, and all farm kids know this, and put it up on the gallows, and we would stand there with the bucket and take the innards and, you know, and it was perfectly normal behaviour. And then he would hang it for a couple of days in a big calico sack in the porch at the back, so you would have to walk through it every time you came into the house. And some visitors weren't accustomed to this tradition, and it was upsetting for them, but it was all perfectly normal for any country kid.
So all these things that you're able to bring to mind, Rosalie, were you an observant child?
I was, and I didn't know that I was until I started writing, and then I realised that I'd collected a lot of it. I only really retain good things. The terrible things that happened, I don't seem to recall them, and I think that's possibly I went into myself and created my own little world when things got a bit rough around the house. But I do remember very fondly, childhood backline cricket and all that kind of stuff.
Tell me about some of the notable characters in town that, as you say, were just everyday people to you, but with hindsight maybe appear a bit unusual.
Well, they were. Well, the lady that you referred to earlier who every day would drag herself down to the shops with a basket over her frozen arm, and she sort of had a Munchausen expression on her face. And I remember one day asking my mum what was wrong with her. She was always beautifully dressed and everybody knew her and she was well cared for and looked after quite well by the locals. And my mother said, she was sewing and the end of a needle broke off and travelled. But in hindsight, it was clearly a stroke. But these were the stories that came around. And I was doing a talk just in the last few years and I related that story and someone stood up and said, I'm from Jerilderie and my mum told me that story too. So it's kind of sort of how it becomes fact when in fact it's probably not.
What about the man you saw outside your window some nights?
Yeah, he would, look, there was a lot. There was a flat earther. There were all sorts of people in that town, but he was particularly well known because after work he would go to the pub. And the story was that he spent a certain amount of time at the pub, and when he started talking to himself and gesticulating to people that weren't there, that the barman would put a few beers in front of him, cans of beer, and it would be his signal to walk home, and then he would make his way home. And I'm not sure what the problem was. I think it was probably something to do with post-traumatic stress from a war or something like that. But we were quite familiar with him, and I just saw him one night lying in my bed and I rolled over and looked out the window and there he was talking to a lamppost. He had a loaf of bread and he dropped it and he was asking the lamppost, now you pick that up, you dropped it, you pick that up. And then I just rolled over and went back to sleep again.
You mentioned a flat earther. Who were they?
Look, I don't know, but my dad was a counsellor, a shire counsellor. And I just remember him coming home and saying, look, there's a wretched flat earther to the north of the town. He keeps writing us all these letters complaining to us about the earth.
Complaining about the globe.
He's a pest. He's a pest. And I do remember the next day getting on my push bike and going for a ride past that house that he talked about. It had a flat roof.
Maybe that's where he got the idea.
I don't know. But that's how. Then I put a flat earther in the Dressmaker, and then that's Septimus Crescent, and he's got a flat head.
And the turkey farmer, tell me about how he was. Maybe it was an unusual job for him to have.
He was our next door neighbour where we lived in town, and Mr. McNichol, Elmo McNichol was his name, because there was a corrugated iron fence and it was quite tall. And in the backyard, he would be out there and Mr. McNichol would sneeze and all the turkeys, and I don't know how many, there were a lot, and they would all gobble. And it used to amuse the heck out of us kids in the backyard, we just thought it was very funny.
Were any of these people considered odd or outsiders in town?
No, you're only an outsider if you were a blow-in, and there was a bus that came every day or once a week and dropped someone off or took someone away, and there was a story attached to that. You had to find out why. But if you were part of the fabric of the community, what you were was just what you were. And it's small communities, wherever they are very loyal and they're very helpful, and they stick together. And so you could be odd to a certain degree, as long as you didn't transgress. People would go, no, that's just the way he is. That's all right. He's all right. He's harmless, or she's harmless, or...
He may be a flat earther, but he's our flat earther.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. And he's all right. And, if you turned up for support the footy club or do something like that, then you are perfectly acceptable.
So tell me a little about your own family, Rosalie. When you came along, how many kids were there already?
I've got 3 older siblings, 2 brothers and a sister.
And were your parents young when they got married?
My mum was. My mum was 23 and my dad was 9 years older than her, and she wasn't from Jerilderie. She was from Castlemaine, and she came to Jerilderie when she married my dad. Yeah.
What kind of farm did your dad have? What was on?
They lived in town. The farm was only 9 miles in those days. And the farm was sheep, wheat, and a few cattle, I think, in those days, and a couple of horses for the kids. And it was hard work. My dad he used to hire people to help him at harvest and shearing, but he spent a lot of time out there on that farm on his own, on a tractor and the old Nuffield, and drove to and from every day with his tucker box and a few dogs. Yeah.
Was he interested in the world beyond the farm?
Oh, yeah. And I often think about him, because he haunted the library. He had a great stack of books either side of him in bed. He was a bit of an insomniac, and so you could get home at any time of the night, which is sometimes a bit treacherous, and he would be sitting up in bed reading a book, and he knew a lot about everything. He had a, tremendous general knowledge, and our chores were to buy the Age newspaper and a loaf of bread of an afternoon on the way home from school, and then clean the fireplace and set the fire. And he would stand at the bench next to the Argo and read the paper while he was cooking tea. I once asked him if he liked being a farmer, and he said, I wanted to be a train driver. He loved steam trains. He had a real passion for them, but he said he was advised not to. He felt the need to continue the sheep stud that his father had started, and I think he felt obliged to that because neither of his siblings wanted to take on the farm, and so he was the youngest. Went to boarding school at the age of 9, and I just think that he knew that this was his path and he must take it.
Was he an affectionate dad?
No, he wasn't. He wasn't really. He wasn't that offhand blokey, oh, look at you kind of thing. He was a bit like that, but you could get a cuddle out of him if you really tried. But he was sort of a bit awkward, and I think that had a lot to do with 400,000 years at boarding school.
What happened in your family, Rosalie, when you were 9 or so?
Oh, back in those days it was a very scandalous thing, but in my memory, being the youngest, there was something happened, and I'm not quite sure what it was, but all of a sudden my mother wasn't in the same bedroom as my father, and there was a lot of tension and a lot of arguments, and turns out my mother was having an affair, and that was a terrible thing, and she didn't actually leave the family home for quite some time until she found somewhere to live. So there was arguments and there was tension, and our father tried to make it okay for us. But yeah, it wasn't a very pleasant time. And my memories of it, of course, are quite different to my older siblings.
How did you find out that your mum had moved out of home?
Somebody told me. I think I can't remember who it was or how it happened, but somebody said, oh, your mother's moved out of your house. And I went home to the family home and somehow discovered that she'd gone and that she'd moved into a flat. So I got on my trusty push bike and rode up to her flat, and she was sitting in the kitchen of her little flat, which was in the main street of Jerilderie, and she'd taken the garden furniture. So she was sitting on, those chairs that are just slats, and the table was just slats, and so she was sitting there in her new flat with a friend. I can't remember who that was. I suspect it was Valerie from across the road, and she had a glass of beer and a cigarette in hand. But
how did she seem?
Oh, she seemed all right, but I think what happened with her was she got a hepatitis when she was about 30, I think, and the Dr. Southey, had said to her, you'll be in a wheelchair by the time you're 40. And I think after that she just went, bugger this, I'm out of here and I'm going to have good fun. So she was all right. She was good, but it was hard because there was no pension, there was no support, there was no anything for her at that point. So she had to find work locally, and that's when she took up dressmaking in a very serious way.
You say that what sort of precipitated her moving out was her having an affair, having a relationship with someone else. Who was that?
That was a man who worked on the Department of Main Roads, and so they'd come through fixing the roads, and he was a tall, dark, handsome, dashing kind of chap, and he was a good time guy. She would have met him at the pub, and they had a wow of a time. It was the 60s. And he joined the JADS, the Jerilderie Amateur Dramatic Society, and she joined the JADS, and I just think she set about having good fun, and he was good for her for a few years, and they probably would have continued on, I think, having a fine old time together. But he had a car accident, and that was a terrible thing for her, I think. It wasn't easy for her at all.
Just as you say, the separation and divorce in the 1960s was a scandalous thing. Was this before no-fault divorce?
Yeah, way before.
So what did that mean?
That mean they would have had to prove adultery. And that would have been hard to do because there was only 800 people and everybody would have known everything, you know. So I remember sitting in solicitors' offices, and I don't remember this, but my best friend remembers that I was crying. I came to her place crying because they'd asked us to choose who we wanted to live with. I mean, really. But anyway, we ended up going week about. But always in the family home of a weekend, but we went week about. And, you know, it would have been horrible for my dad. It would have been terrible for everybody, really.
So was your mum on the outer in town after leaving your dad?
Yes, she was. Only with a certain social set, so shall we say. But for her mates at the pub, you know, she was having a lovely time. And I do remember something happened at one occasion and she'd moved into a little house and she was sewing to make a living, and I remember her saying one day, so-and-so's not speaking to me and they don't come to me for dresses anymore. But they were back. I remember then coming home a week or so later and there they were. And I think it was her dressmaking skills and her general genial, lovely personality, really.
So after that divorce and that request from the court that you could choose and you end up spending part of the time with your mum and part of the time with your dad, what were things like at home with your dad after your mum had moved out? Like, how did he manage with all the domestic stuff?
Oh, he was terrific. It was really good. He hired Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Daddle and they came and did the cleaning and the laundry. And he did, I suppose you could call it cooking. He used to put a leg of lamb in the slow oven of the Arga at 7 o'clock in the morning and go to the farm for the day and then come home and pour frozen mixed vegetables into one saucepan and potatoes into the other and mash them with a piece of wood. and that was dinner. But after a while, he just got my sister and I to do cooking because, of course, in those days we studied home economics and needlework, and so we would cook. But, you know, it was good. And Friday night it was all, when we're all together in the family home, he would take us for fish and chips, a bottle of drink and a Mars bar and a block of chocolate or something like that. So that was always quite a celebration.
What about life at your mum's? How did that compare to time with your dad?
Oh, my gosh. My mum used to like a party and she, you know, she was good. She provided and she sewed and she worked hard and she had arthritis, terrible arthritis, but she was often at the pub. But I always knew where to find her. You know, you did. We just walk down the main street and see where someone's car is and know where they are. Failing that, ask someone. Someone always knew. And so, yeah, but she was absent basically in a lot of ways. She was more interested in making up for lost time and having a wow of a time. But I kind of found a home with my best friend Terry and her family and kind of settled in there for important girl-type lessons. And my mum was quite happy about all that, and she was always there hovering, and I always knew she loved me dearly, but she kind of liked having a good time too.
So sewing was how she made her money after she moved out of home. Where did she learn to sew?
I think that she just learned because that's what you did. She was a beautiful dressmaker. She was just gorgeous. Some of her craft was really, really quite lovely, despite her arthritic hands. And I just think, for women of that generation, and I know that with my peers it's the same thing, there was a lot of people that were very creative and who could have had other lives in another generation. If they'd been born 50 years later or 20 years later, they could have had an entirely different life. And I think that she would have loved a much more creative life, rather than, okay, now you will get married and have babies because that's what girls do. Mm.
What sort of things did she sew?
She made everything. She used to make the school uniforms for the primary school. That was a big earner. She used to put patches on the front of a singlet where a ram's horn had worn away a shearer's blue singlet.
They were frugal times with a singlet.
Well, they're just, it was a small country town. You couldn't actually rush out and buy new ones, and there was no such thing. You could wait for the Myers catalogue or something like that. So she did things like that, hemming things, altering things. She made wedding dresses. She was very good at making wedding dresses in a hurry for people and making the darts a little bit higher than their tummy. She was very good at debutante dresses. She would sew anything to make some money.
Did she have a space at home, or where would she do all that?
She did. In the end, she ended up knocking out a wall between the lounge room and the bedroom, and she set up her little sewing room in there. But I just remember the ladies would come and stand on a little table in her big main lounge room, and I would hold the pin tin. And that's where I heard all those expressions like, I need to look better than Mrs. O'Brien at the ball, things like that. And I heard things that I shouldn't really have heard, but we all knew how to keep a secret.
Did she sew your clothes too?
She did. She would make things for fancy dress parties, and they were brilliant. They were really good, and she made things like that for me. And if I wanted something, she would make it. I would just bring her the pattern. And she made my wedding dress because I took the cover of a magazine with the dress on it and said, can you make that? And she said, yes. And she did. And it had a cowl neck and it had to be supported by a corset, because it didn't have any straps. And she just made it. She sat down and made it.
When you describe, Rosalie, that generation of women who really had their futures laid out for them, it was such a bold thing for your mum to step outside of that and follow a heart or a loins or whatever it was that led her to coal, and then have this life that she made for herself. I mean, does she strike you as a courageous kind of person?
Defiant would be more the word. Just stubborn. Lovely person, but if she didn't want to do it, she wouldn't do it. And it was very courageous of her to do that, especially with no support, no financial support, and in that small community. It would have been awful for my poor darling dad, but, I think she just wanted to live life. I think she knew that this was it. She wasn't going to get a second chance. She managed to have a good time. She managed to have a few boyfriends. One of them was 20 years younger than her and rode a BSA 650. She travelled, she went on Women's Weekly tours overseas, and my dad did a little bit of travelling too, and they just kind of got on with things. Yeah, but it wasn't easy for either of them.
You ended up finishing high school at boarding school in Melbourne. Did living in the city give you a different perspective on that world, that little world that you'd grown up in?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Like to be objective, you have to, you've got to leave, and then you look back and you see what the place is like. And it was a double whammy, because boarding school, there was a different hierarchy, there was a whole different thing. I did deportment, I did ballroom dancing, I discovered literature, all that kind of stuff. And then I looked back at Jerilderie and thought, what an unusual place, But it's not really, because there are the same people in a city, you just don't see them because there's too many other people. But yeah, I did. I looked back on my country upbringing and thought both how glorious and how weird it was. But I think most childhoods are sort of benignly weird.
So why did you end up living in another country town after finishing school? Why weren't you done with country towns after escaping to the big smoke of Melbourne?
That was a boy. I went there for a boy. Goodness.
I'm not sensing that ended well.
Well, it did actually, because I got dumped rather rudely, and then I went off to London, and my friend Janet was over in London, and I was so devastated by being dumped in front of the entire town, who knew that he was having an affair, but no one bothered to tell me, that I went to London. And again, I looked back on where I'd come from and thought, oh no, that was no good. That is just no good. And looked at London and living in a house with a floating population of travellers and going and seeing every band. We saw Led Zeppelin, we saw the Rolling Stones, Frank Zappa, everyone you can possibly imagine. If it was on, we went. It was just a wonderful time. And we went everywhere and did everything. We would get in a car and drive to Scotland, or we would, and we just had a party. I had the best Christmas I've ever had in my entire life there with 35 people, and it was just a hoot. I just really loved it. And I still have friends from those days now.
Broadcast, podcast. You're listening to Conversations.
Rosalie, you said you'd studied deportment when you were at boarding school. How did that come in handy amid your time seeing bands and partying in pubs in London?
Well, I had a job because I'd studied nursing. I was a nurse's aide. And so I got a job looking after a lady called Lady Manton, and she was in Belgrave Square. And her house, I'd like to say it was a bit like Buckingham Palace. It was just sumptuous.
Certainly compared to your place at Earl's Court,
oh,
I
my
imagine.
Lord, you could not get anywhere more opposite, And I think about it now, and I think I must have stank of, cigarette smoke and beer and... Anyway, but I went to her place, walked to her place every day and looked after her. She had a hairline fracture of the neck of femur. She'd fallen down her sumptuous stairs. And yeah, that was a real eye-opener to me. And that's when all the deportment and the table manners and all that kind of stuff kicked in. And I was basically there to do whatever she wanted me to do when she rang the bell, because she was just sitting in bed with this beautiful, glorious satin bedspread, and it's just gorgeous. I would bring her tea, I would take her meals, I would write down for the doctor what she ate and what she hadn't eaten, and things like that, and keep her away from the grog cupboard too was another major thing.
Who told you? How did you know that was part of your requirement?
Ramona was the housekeeper, and the first day I was there, she showed me all the drink bottles with the lipstick around the top and said, don't let her get down the stairs. And for someone with a hairline crack in her femur, she could get down those stairs quite easily. But I kind of felt sad for her because it was the only good thing in her life as far as I could see. I mean, she had visitors and stuff, but,
So you were having a ball, it sounds like, in London at this stage. Did you think much about your future or what it might look like?
Not a thing. Couldn't care less. Having a lovely time. I had my nurse's aid degree. I was fine.
You had some adventurous travels to South America and other places. Eventually you found yourself back in Australia.
Yes.
What were you doing once you were back home?
Oh, look, I had a midlife crisis. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I broke up with a beautiful South American boy, and I walked into a careers advisory shop, and I encountered somebody's mum, a middle-aged kind of lady, and she said, how can I help you? And I said, look, I'm at the crossroads of my life. I don't know what I want to do.
How old were you, Rosalie?
I was 29 at this point. And she said to me, what have you always dreamed of doing? And I said, well, look, I used to fancy that I would be a famous actress. And she said, you need to be a drama teacher. And so she sent me off to Rusden, which is now Deakin, and I studied drama and literature. And that was again, broken hearts are very good for you. And that was another life that I embarked on then, writing plays and, putting things on, studying literature again and having a wow of a time again.
You were living in a share house in Melbourne at this point with your little dog, John.
Yep.
What would John get up to?
John was actually a Labrador.
Not so little.
Not so little, no. And he was perpetually on a diet. So he used to listen for the school bell because there was a school around the corner. And so he would go at morning tea, morning recess, and at lunchtime, and he would clean up the yard. And he got to know the kids, and they all knew him, and they used to come and see him, or they used to drop in and pat him on the way. He did it in lots of places, actually. I used to get phone calls from schools in other places. They'd say, look, we've got John again. He's in science,
He's just had a great ham sandwich, but please come and collect him.
And he used to smell their satchels. He'd sit at the gate, and when they walked past, his nose would go up, and he'd go, all right, I know what I want for lunch. I'll go there. Yeah.
Who did John become friends with at the local school?
Oh, well, he became friends with Morgan, who was 5 at the time, and Morgan had a dad called Ian, and I kind of got to know them through John, my dog, and Morgan one day asked John around for a play date with his dog, and Morgan credits himself with this and says, no, it was him that got Ian and I together. And he's not wrong.
I think it's the Labrador. I think the matchmaker in this story was John, and all credit should go to him.
Yeah.
and his stomach, actually.
Blessing. Yeah.
So through John meeting Morgan, you meet Morgan's dad, Ian.
Yep.
How quickly did you two move in together?
Well, it just so happens that he needed a tenant, and the house I was living in was kind of breaking up, and they were going to knock it down and build apartments. So I just was talking to Ian about it one day, and he said, you can live in my front room for $45 a week, which was pretty reasonable. And I went, okay, fine. And so I just moved around the corner and moved in with him. And I remember he said to me, if it doesn't work out with the dog will have to go. And I said, well, if the dog goes, I'll go. And he said, yeah, that's fair enough. And then he said, I remember him saying, and the dog will have to stay outside. The dog won't be allowed inside. And so we settled down on our first evening in front of the fire because it was winter. And John sat with his toes on the threshold looking at us from outside. And then Ian said, oh, perhaps he can come inside because it is cold out there. Anyway, I think within a week, the three of us were sharing the same room, me, John and Ian. and it was, just a wonderful, lovely thing to happen, to fall on my feet, a house-trained man, my dog, ready-made family, and, security and happiness all at once. And I just settled into it and got on with it. I thought, oh, this is good. And it turned out to be the best thing.
Besides being a man of strong boundaries, clearly, when it comes to dogs, he was never going to let himself cross. What sort of person was Ian?
He wasn't ordinary. He was a singular person. He was perfectly content with his own company. He was creative. He was kind of a polymath. He read everything he knew. He was a bit like my dad in that way, in that his general knowledge was exceptionally good. And one of the reasons I really liked him was that he didn't mansplain. He didn't lecture you on stuff. If you asked, he would tell you. But he just was perfectly self-contained and quite content with who he was and where he was, wanted to raise his son, wanted to reconnect with his daughter, all that sort of stuff. And so he just basically said, you have a lovely time, you do your life and I'll do mine, and I'll see you back here every night. And that's the way we always functioned. And I liked that. And he seemed to like me exactly as I was, which I found very refreshing.
What did he do for work?
He was a prop and set builder. So he built stage sets and things for ads on television and a lot of things for films. And that's what he did, as well as being a single dad.
And so did he have were you impressed by some of the creations he would come up with? Were they being constructed in the house around you, or did he have a workshop or what?
No, at that point he was working from home because he was being a single dad, and he was making a tram for a film called Malcolm. And then he helped make the yellow car that splits in half and it's two motorcycles. And so he did things like that. He kind of would figure out how it worked. And I just remember one of our early dates, we went to a pub and there was a man dismantling the jukebox, and he spent most of the time watching the man dismantle the jukebox, and they were talking about how it worked while I sat at a table with a Parmigiana or something, I don't know. And I didn't mind. He was what he was, and
you enjoyed his curiosity or his mind.
And I liked it because I got to be who I was, and it was good.
You're a handy person as well. Who was in charge of the DIY and home maintenance at your place?
Yeah, well, we both were, because that's one of the things my dad did teach me. He taught me how to shoot a gun, how to change a fuse, how to change a tyre, keep a pair of stockings, pantyhose in your car in case your fan belt breaks, a Hessian sack to kneel on when you're changing a tyre, bought me my first hammer at a clearing sale. You know, things like that kind of set us up to be independent people. So I was used to being independent, and so was Ian, and so it was good.
As you've mentioned, he had children, so you became a stepmum and getting together with Ian. How did that suit you?
It was great. It was terrific. They were lovely kids. They both had mothers at this point, and so I just got on with being a flatmate, really. I did a bit of cooking. I did a bit of school drop-off, things like that, but I wasn't the primary carer, and I just wanted everything to work nicely. And having come from a broken family myself, I kind of knew what I was doing, and I knew that, you know, if I was going to be in that relationship, then I had to be in it. There was no, I don't think I want to be here. After a while, I worked that out and decided I would have to commit, and I basically committed on the basis of that because I always knew where to find my parents, and it would be good if everybody could find their parents when they needed them.
Courtesy of that careers officer, advisor, you had found yourself into theatre and literature. How or why did you make the switch from theatre into novel writing? How did that happen?
That was hilarious. I used to put on plays, but I cast all my friends because I couldn't afford a professional actor, and I was the writer, producer, psychologist, financer, publicist, props person. Ian built the props and sets for me, you know, and got mates to direct and all this kind of stuff. And I just remember one day somebody phoning me, one of the actors, and saying, I'm responsible for getting the speakers out of the boot and they're very heavy, and I think that you should come and help me lift them out, because he was indignant, you know, that he was being asked to help out, and he thought that he would be an actor. Because anyway, I was really quite tolerant, you know, and I said to one of them one night, a guy who was helping me direct, I said, I really can't drive you home tonight. It's too far. I'm too tired. And he just looked at me and said, well, you'll have to find me a taxi. And I thought, he was still a student himself, you know, but because he had this... Anyway, what I did was I took all those appalling people and I put them into the last scene in the Dressmaker, and I took all their tantrums and all their things and put them in the Macbeth, and got my revenge in that way. But it was just too hard. And then a friend, Jennifer, found me crying in the storeroom at work one day and said, why don't you go to RMIT and do professional writing and editing? And I did. I wanted to do screenwriting and playwriting, but they were full, those classes. And a teacher called Anthony Yark stopped me and said, no, why don't you do novel and short story? 600 people applied for this course and you got in. You've obviously got something, so do that. And so I did. And I remember going to the novel class and the teacher saying, write down in 500 words what your first novel's going to be about. And I had a few ideas for short stories and things like that, so I just wrote 500 words about what would be the Dressmaker. And I wrote the Dressmaker to pass the course. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I was one of those people that rocked up every week. I was early, my pens were lined up, my papers were folded nicely, and I'd written, if the homework was right, 3,000 words, I'd written 10, and I just fell into it and thought, I don't know how, but I seem to be able to do this. I didn't know whether it was any good or not, but I just kept writing because it was a damn fine thing to do.
How much of your mum's story made it into the final version of The Dressmaker?
It was the basis for it, the whole idea that you could be shunned for not conforming, for not being as you were expected. I did that. And I also knew about, vanity and that whole thing of people saying, make me look beautiful. And then she would make them a dress and they would walk away feeling beautiful. I just somehow I don't know what it is with writers, but you kind of accumulate that stuff and then you can dig in and bring it out and use it at some point. And so when I sat down, I just dug into my memory and brought all of those things out and put them on the page. And there's a certain amount of competition within the class. And so I flexed my writerly muscles. So there's too many characters, too many metaphors, too many similes, too many symbols, too many images. But for some reason, it just worked and they published it. So I'm not going to complain.
Not only did they publish it, people kept buying it and reading it and loving it. And then it was turned into a film starring Kate Winslet.
Yes.
What was your reaction when you heard she was going to be in the lead role?
Well, I didn't believe my friend Sue Maslin that I'd been to school with, who was also born and raised in Jerilderie.
And was a producer.
Was the producer. And she and I were playing golf one afternoon and she said to me, I've got Kate Winslet for the lead role. And I went, yeah, funny, as if someone's going to come out and be in a film about a book I wrote to pass a course. And so I kind of went, oh, that's great, but didn't really believe her. And then she showed me an email and I still thought, oh, no, that could be from anyone. But no, it was true. It was all true.
And did you spend time on set as they were making the film?
Yep, that was hilarious. That was one of the conditions. So I just said to Sue, yes, you can make my book into a film on the condition that me and all my friends and family can be extras and I want to go to every red carpet occasion on the planet. And she said, no worries. Of course you can.
And did they live up to your expectations? What were those different experiences like?
Oh, it was very tedious, very boring, but it was hilarious at the same time because I was with a bunch of mates and relatives. And, my nephew, who's normally a farmer, decided that he could be in it since it had Shane Jacobson in it, and he went, yeah, all right, I'll be in it. And my other niece, who's a nurse, she got to be in it. And so we were together and having a lovely, lovely time. But there was an awful lot of sitting around. My friend Meredith and Angela were in it and their sisters and their cousins and all sorts of people were just sort of, we ended up being this very solid, happy little group hanging around on the edges.
What did your hometown think of the finished film? Because the locals don't come off too well in The Dressmaker.
We thought that we were going to be hung, drawn and quartered when we went back to Jerilderie, Sue and I. But the CWA just put on a great big beautiful bash for us and said, well done, girls. They all know, everybody knows that small communities have all similar characters and characteristics and, that it wasn't really true. I dramatised the heck out of it and turned it into fiction and something that would push people's buttons, which is the purpose of writing. So they were pretty good about it, I think, yeah.
This lovely life that you and Ian had made together was derailed by Alzheimer's. When did you start to notice that something was up with him?
Well, I worked in aged care, but I was used to the end when they were admitted to aged care, so they were fairly severely affected. So I didn't really kind of notice. He was older than me and I just thought he was turning into a curmudgeon. I just thought, he was kind of controlling and, and this had gone on for quite some time, years. But I'd got accustomed to it and used to it and kept thinking I'm going to leave, but I never did. And then in 2013, he finally said, look, there's something wrong. And so we went off and saw about it and got the diagnosis and prepared ourselves as much as one can for what was to come. And it's a sad and terrible thing, but in that situation, because I'd done aged care, I just kind of went, right, I'm going to steer this. I'm going to do this. This will be all right. Took that role on.
In becoming his carer, Rosalie, what did that mean for you day to day?
That meant that I no longer was his wife. I was his carer. In fact, sometimes he would wake up and he would look at me and I'd go, it's all right, I'm your wife. And you could see the look of relief. But it meant gradually you just take on all responsibility and you have to relearn the skills that you lost when you got married. For example, removing huntsmen, hanging pictures, all that kind of stuff. You have to learn all the stuff about paying bills and plumbers and electricians and builders and driving and mechanics and all those sorts of things. You've just got to figure them out. Centrelink, oh my Lord, Centrelink, the aged care system, all those sorts of things. You just do it. You just go, all right, this is what we have to do and we're going to do this. But at the same time, you have to be kind and loving and patient, and sometimes you just can't do it.
I was going to say, there is enormous love and patience that goes into that, but there's another side. There has to be another side to it.
Yeah.
What did you learn about anger and frustration in those years?
Oh, my God. I used to talk to myself a lot and scream and yell and drink wine. I drank wine. But you just have to keep reminding yourself, this is not him. He's not like this. This is the disease. Lovely Ian is still in there. And there's an awful stage that they go through where they ask the same questions and they drive you nuts and they're suspicious, you've stolen my money and all that sort of stuff. But then that passes and then you're left with someone who desperately needs you to be their everything. And so you just hold that person's hand literally and metaphorically for however long it takes. And you kind of get used to it. Your life just adjusts and you just kind of take it in your stride. But I had help and support from the kids and from the family, and Morgan made me buy a sensible car and could accommodate and all that. And they were great help. So you kind of get through it. People gather around. It was good.
Ian was eventually diagnosed with cancer, so time narrowed sharply. How did you spend those final months, that final time together?
Very happily. There was no point anymore forcing him to go to doctor's appointments or put him through any of this arduous kind of stuff. So we just made it lovely. And it was COVID and my orchids were blooming and the sun was shining, and so I just made him comfortable and happy with jazz, a shot of whiskey, the television, the dog. We always had a dog. We've always had a dog, and just made everything lovely for him.
What about the grandkids? How were they around their granddad as this change happened?
That was one of the blessings because they just responded as kind, lovely human beings. We might have said Granddad's sick, or it was obvious that he was sick. And so they were very kind and lovely, and they played games with him and they watched TV with him and they brought him food and drink and, they were just very attentive. And he had a wheelchair at this point, so that was huge fun for them. And so they would sit on him and, they were very good. It was very good. No matter where we went or what we did, if it was basketball practice or whatever, Granddad was there. They were just lovely with him. It was a beautiful thing.
So with the support and love of your family, you gave Ian the gift of this very loving final stage and goodbye. What were you like then by that stage after Ian had died and you'd acquitted this role, this responsibility that had taken 10 years or so of your life? What sort of state were you in?
I thought that I was fine. I was very happy with the fact that he had been there when I wrote The Dressmaker. I said, look, I'm going to write a novel. And he said, good on you, go for it. And he was still there at the last, he was there for Molly, which is the end of the series of The Dressmaker. And so I was grateful for that. And I floated around fully restored because I'd been through that whole process and gained all the skills I'd lost and taken on more. And I'd inherited his shed and 3 ladders and all that kind of stuff. And so it was good. But I wasn't. And I still find now, grief's a funny thing, but happily most people have been through it. So when I lose it for no reason, randomly, people kind of understand because you don't know when it's going to happen. But when I think of Ian now, I feel very happy because we had a very lovely thing together. And you I've just forgotten all the horrible bits and I just remember what he was like. And so I'm kind of left with a beautiful big house that he built and all these lovely memories and an intact, functioning, lovely family, the kids and the grandkids, and we still carry on as we did. And we speak about him often and he's everywhere in the house. And so I kind of still live with him, really.
This new book, the latest book, Molly, is brings to a close the story of the dressmaker in a way. Does that mean you're done with that little hometown and recreating it? Are those stories told now?
I don't really ever want to go back to Dungatar again. I think I've flogged it to death. I'm going to see if I can stretch myself in other directions and write something with characters that aren't quite so grotesque or lovable and grotesque at the same time. So I'll see. I'll think about it after Christmas.
Is writing a pleasure for you?
Love it. Yep, very happy. I mean, it's arduous in that it's like walking around knowing you've got an essay to submit tomorrow. But it's a joyous time now because the book is out and there it is. And I'm very pleased with that. But I do love to write. And I like to write every day, even if I write garbage, I don't care. I just like typing something out.
I think your mum would have been very interested in the life that you've made for yourself.
Yeah,
Rosalie.
I think she would have been quite pleased. And my dad. They both would have been very, very happy about it, I'm sure.
Well, I'm very happy to have met you and had the chance to have this conversation. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Oh, thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Rosalie Ham's new novel is called Molly. This conversation was produced by Alice Moldovan and recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. Carmel Rooney is our executive producer. I'm Sarah Konoski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Konoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.